Well, here we are, and this is the finale, and I am so delighted to be here. My name's Luanne McKinnon, and I want to start today by thanking my exceptional friend, Siri Vaith, for inviting me. I was really shocked by the invitation a few months ago. She said, "Would you come and give the final keynote at the research conference?" And I thought, a little on the wings of Isa Stenzel, well, why me? There's so many better other people to do this. But here I am, and I am so proud to be here. I also want to give a big shout out to the CFRI team, those beautiful women and the volunteers, all the exhibitors that came have just made this such a fascinating and fabulous conference. And to the supporters in alphabetical order, the Boomer Esiason Foundation, the Gilead, Vertex, Viatris, AbbVie should have been first. And I must say that I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for my lung donor, who has given me the miracle of 13 extra years. This person remains anonymous to me. We had written notes and cards to the family, translated into Spanish. It was ultimately theorized that they had left the area. Perhaps I have the organs of someone who had come up to pick crops. And I give a deep bow of gratitude to their life that has saved mine. I also want to recognize and honor my husband, Daniel Reeves, who's here with me today. He has been my steadfast helper. He has provided me courage and strength through so many challenges that are CF. My presentation today is going to be in two parts. Unlike the scientific papers that you've heard, this is a bit of a testimonial, so I'll be reading because it is a narrative rather than data. Oh, and I have a doofer I have to pay attention to. All right. Is it the big green one or the palm tree? Yeah, here we go. Part 1, Little Me, Then and Now. Before I entered the CF mansion of many rooms, that is, before a name was given to my coughing and digestive troubles, I was probably a lot like most other little American girls of the era, but I coughed a lot. My sweet dad would press his ear to my back and listen to my rattling lungs. Then the vaporizer was turned up, and that was about it. In rural Missouri, where I was born in 1955, all that was understood about a disease that some doctors knew to be cystic fibrosis was that children like me would not live long enough to attend elementary school. But how far we have come. I recently read that Trikafta is proving to be highly effective in school-age children whose futures look brighter than ever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. When I was a child, my parents did not know about CF. There was no reason to, since I went undiagnosed for 14 years. Doctors told them, maybe Luanne will outgrow the problems. They concluded that allergies were the cause and gave simplistic warnings to not have a cat or not use feather pillows. Or certainly when Dad was mowing a lawn, stay inside. None of that worked, of course. I kept coughing and coughing and coughing. By the end of the 60s, we had moved from Missouri to West Texas and then to metropolitan Dallas. In 1968, I was 13 years old, small for my age, embarrassingly flat-chested, unlike my teen friends who had their first bras, but not me. And I had weird-looking fingernails. It was who I was. Nearly Christmas of 1968, my coughing had worsened and we raced to the state-of-the-art Presbyterian Hospital in North Dallas. Such was the panic in our station wagon that I still recall my mother's frantic command to my dad, "Exit Walnut Hill, exit," until he hit the brakes at the emergency room. For over 2 weeks, I stayed in the hospital and failed tests for celiac tuberculosis, anemia, lung cancer, and asthma. With no conclusion as to what was wrong, I was finally given a sweat chloride test and it came back positive. The result was that I had something called cystic fibrosis. Cystic what? I had said, cystic what? What did it mean? No one explained to me, although hushed tones between the nurses made me suspicious of just how bad things might be. I stayed in the hospital another 2 weeks. Treatments were draconian. IVs dripped through long, hard stainless needles threaded through my scrawny veins. My arms were taped down to a wooden board, hand to elbow. Nights in a mist tent drenched my hair and pajamas, and PT at the time was nearly a beating. Finally, at home, and like a student given a foreign language assignment, I became proficient in the dialects of nebulizer and pills. And since my illness now had a name, well, I thought the doctors could fix it once and for all. Surely they could. It was 1969. I believed that curing me had to be possible because, after all, we saw the TV broadcast of Apollo 11 land on the moon. This was a place 250,000 miles from home, and such was the miracle of human effort there. Why couldn't my coughing fits and fitful tummy be cured? Why would that be so hard in the face of 3 astronauts doing what seemed like the impossible? They could even talk to the men in Houston from space. Uh-oh, I did not get it. Sorry. Is our sound on back there, folks? Oh, we have to move them up? Oh. But I have sound here. AV, my sound should be on. Did you hear the moon? Did you hear the moon? Did you hear the moon? It should be here. Living proof. My parents were told I'd live to be 19. In other words, CF is fatal. Enjoy the time you have left. The clock was ticking. And one would think we would make plans to have some fun, maybe to go to the Grand Canyon or see the Lincoln Memorial, but no, nothing like that, since the news of my lifespan was so cataclysmic that the best thing we could do was to rally. And we did. But the clincher was, I was not told of my end-of-life prognosis. Probably a very smart move at the time. So in my innocence, I kept on playing the clarinet, taking art lessons, and having a teen life shaped by a medical regime. The work to keep my lungs clear became part of my everyday life. And yet I maintained life in a bubble. CF was my secret. I wasn't ashamed, but what should I say at 14 or 15 when I felt like I was the only person with the disease? I did not know a single CF teen or young adult. I never crossed paths with them, not once, even in the hospital. And such was my cloistered Sorry. None of my interactives are working, so we'll just go plain here. Such was my cloistered identity that my best friends did not even know my diagnosis. They just thought I coughed a lot. The tremendous programs on offer at CFRI and other CF patient-based foundations contrast greatly to my experience in the 1960s and 70s. My family was not offered any social services or counseling. We had no voice beyond visits to the doctor. So now to live at a time when CFers are offered mental health, counseling, outreach for young moms, reproductive health information, educational scholarships, on and on, is something that we should not take for granted. Living proof. With time on my side, I increasingly became, with time on my side, I turned 19. I was not only alive, but active in the CF sense of the word. The year was 1975, and I was a sophomore in college studying in Rome. On weekends, I'd take overnight trains from Stazione San Pietro near the Vatican to towns and cities across Europe. Let's see. And just in case I landed in an emergency room, I brought 2 chest x-rays taken in Dallas that I rolled up in a faux hippie duffel bag. I also hauled a boxy DeVilbiss nebulizer and a hot plate setup that were cushioned by a pair of bell bottoms. In tiny hotel rooms, I boiled tap water with saline tablets and added mucomist to the nebulizer tank. I carried adapter plugs to suit the electrical outlets that differed country to country. Looking back at that time, those funky breathing treatments gave this little Texas gal the breathing capacity to climb the marble steps up to the Acropolis and pedal a bike to the Van Gogh Museum to see the sunflowers for the first time. Living proof. By the mid-1980s, now in my 30s, I was a New Yorker. My doctor, Caroline Denning, was a robust woman with a terrific sense of humor who directed the pediatric and adult CF clinics at St. Vincent's Hospital in Greenwich Village. She was assisted by Dr. John Jacoby, a remarkable person and a friend of mine who was about my age. He had CF, and he was also a CF doctor. At St. Vincent's, we adults were admitted to the children's ward. The rooms were decorated with clowns holding red balloons. The circus theme cheered the kids, but for us adults, it was just all wrong, as if we really shouldn't be there. It was a fact that in the 1980s, there was no one counting on there being much of an adult CF population, and so we bunked up. And why not? Since separate adult wing was not to be invested in at the time. I was admitted regularly and became friends with my respiratory therapist, who worked freelance. Lucky for me, Sue lived near my job at a Midtown art gallery in New York. After work, I'd rush down 57th Street, cross jam-packed Park Avenue, and head to Sue's apartment. We'd put the postural drainage board on her kitchen table. And while she clapped my rib cage, I'd stare out the window at Bloomingdale's and listen to the rush hour of cabs, CF in the fast lane. The New York years were dashed when a pulmonologist bluntly told me, "You should not live here. The air is unhealthy. You should go home." I took him seriously, but sorting out where to go from a big life in Manhattan, hard won, took some time. I settled in the Blue Ridge of Virginia and enrolled in a writing course in art history at the university in Charlottesville. Accepted into the graduate program, I shifted my sights to scholarship and specifically the art of Picasso in the 1930s. Boom, there's Guernica, 1937. During my years of study, I was a patient at the University of Virginia Hospital and cared for by the great late Dr. Mark Robbins, who saved me time and again. In 1999, I met my husband, Daniel Reeves, whose groundbreaking films were featured at the Virginia Film Festival. Our romance led to marrying in Scotland in 2001 and living there. Pneumonias plagued me, but the CF team in Glasgow and the CF Sinus Surgery Center in London could not have been better. Yet the cold and damp were unfriendly factors in an otherwise fairy tale land. We moved to Daniel's farm in southwestern France, near Bordeaux. There, it was my great fortune to live near the caves of Lascaux to attend Dharma talks by the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who was our countryside neighbor and friend. And I pretended to be French, doing everyday shopping of cheese and bread in our medieval villages. Although there was a CF center in Bordeaux, when I fell ill, I returned to Scotland, where there was no language barrier, and the teams knew me. Living proof. By 2005, we returned to the US. My CF doctor was the gentle and excellent Daniel Leish in Orlando, and 3 years later, it was my great fortune to receive care from the renowned and wonderful Dr. Taylor Kauser, who's with us today. This was in Albuquerque. Challenges to my health intensified in New Mexico due to my demanding job as an art museum director, living at 6,000 feet altitude, and by then I was in my mid-50s. As I slipped into a gradual decline with low oxygen, SATs, low weight, low appetite, and barely able to keep going, I nevertheless carried on in my profession. Cystic fibrosis was raging. I always thought if things got really bad, well, I'd beat it. I never had discussed the possibility of a lung transplant with any of my doctors or teams, ever. My denial or fear or whatever it was so strong that I even referred to transplants as the T. My conviction was never to utter the word, never to say the word. I told myself that by not doing so, that day would never come for me, ever. I was wrong. In 2010, the T had to be discussed. The CF team at the University of New Mexico released me from their care, advising us to seek a transplant center in Denver. Yet the team at Anschutz were certain that they would not be able to procure lungs in a timely manner given my condition. So trying another way, we were recommended to Stanford. Daniel drove us across the American West for the assessment. We returned home, and within a month, Dr. David Weil sent for us to come now, and we left New Mexico without saying to one another that this might be my finale or my future. The wait for a perfect organ match took 9 months. During that time, Daniel worked on a film from home, played ball with our black lab, Maya, at Chrissy Field, and took care of me in all ways. We carried on waiting. Then the call came. On April 3rd, 2011, I was wheeled down a long, gleaming hall to the surgery theater at Stanford. I recall how white everything was. Late day sunshine poured in from the Pacific and cast us in a blinding glow. I love yous, I love you multiplied as the metal doors shut behind me. I was rolled past a large table of surgical implements, and the gurney driver knew he had made a wrong turn and told the anesthesiologist such. Understanding my horror at seeing the array of knives, scissors, vascular clamps, and saws laid out for me, she quickly began to describe her favorite painting, Picasso's The Old Guitarist, a blue period painting that I knew well. Then the effects of anesthesia began to take over. And with The Old Guitarist in mind, I drifted off and saw myself as an astronaut. I was suited up, and like them, I had traveled to a place that not many others do. I didn't know where I was in the universe, but I was sure it was precarious. In the dream, I saw myself surrounded by dark vastness, floating and rotating and traversing infinity. Time passed. I don't know how much. Then, somehow, it seemed I was going to return home. There was no sense of speed and no sense of an accomplishment. It was simply that the mission was over and I was recovering from it. Living proof. I hadn't intended to give you this tour of my life with CF since our community possesses so many unique stories. But as I started to write this presentation, I began to weep. These were tears of grief and gratitude. What had I learned? What have I gone through here? I realized that for nearly 55 years, I had been extremely fortunate to live at a time when so much support was given to my one little life. I had gone from the edge of my lungs' natural capacity to a full recovery. And this was due to the factors of advanced surgery, of a miraculous donor match, of impeccable CF care, and love from so many. It's a long way between medical trials and the success of new meds and therapies. In that span of time, we live our lives and sustain hope and well-being, despite the traumas of CF, which can be lifelong. We are a population that may be struck by pneumonias and bronchiectasis, so Pseudomonas, hemoptysis, cepacias, autonomic disorders, diabetes, kidney and pancreatic disease, sinus infections, depression, cancers, gastro problems, bone depletion, failing organs, and resistant to gene therapies. All this is a harrowing cornucopia that has inspired decades of life-extending and life-saving modalities. As patients, we zig and zag through it all, and because the work at self-care takes so much effort, we see ourselves as champions, even as children. And why not? I think of all my friends with cystic fibrosis who have become moms and dads and athletes and doctors, entrepreneurs, advocates, artists, writers, meditation teachers, social workers, and educators. We thrive because of the great science being done across the world in networks of cooperation that help our maladies and ease our suffering. Almost not me and me. Living proof. I believe the CF story really is a kind of love story because love means, among other things, dedication and action. Our story has been written by many authors. These are people we call doctor, nurse, nutritionist, psychologist, social worker, respiratory therapist, pharmacist, surgeon, public advocate, and certainly mother, father, sister, brother, husband, wife, and friend. I think it is very important for us to see ourselves in the arc of this exceptional story and its continued unfolding. The dimensions of it include histories of agony, this is true, that coexist with our 21st century victories. I think that it is important to be reminded of how far we have come, that in less than a century, a strong bridge has been built between the shores of utter despair and the shores of unparalleled progress. I am humbled by the deep humanity of cystic fibrosis science. I am humbled by the brilliant research and funding of those projects, which is measured by the lives it saves and the distress it mitigates. I am humbled to know that there are thousands of people whose names I will never know that contribute to our survival, and taken as a whole, this enterprise, this vast endeavor, is magnificent in its human greatness and benevolence. But what if any of us living with CF now had never lived when there was no help, when there was nothing at all, when the old question, what is wrong with my baby, could not be answered? Let us remember that in 1938, in a basement pathology lab at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, Dr. Dorothy Anderson concluded 3 years of nearly nonstop research, resulting in correctly identifying CF as a distinct rare disease for the first time. She forged an original path of inquiry, delving into an ocean of medical literature and coalescing the findings on her research dating back before the American Civil War. Dr. Anderson's analysis of infant autopsy reports and the examination of pancreatic tissue samples led to her radical conclusions, first laid out in the groundbreaking paper, Cystic Fibrosis of the Pancreas and its Relation to Celiac Disease. In it, she described nearly 50 cases of infants and young children diagnosed with celiac that she argued showed the hallmark signs of what we now know to be CF. And we are the recipients of Dr. Anderson's unerring work. Living proof. I've been granted the miracle of time. I'm one of the lucky kids. I'm now called a senior. Today marks 2 weeks before my 69th birthday, and what follows will be the 7th decade of my life. I've pretty much reckoned with being a girl interrupted and a woman interrupted and then having a life interrupted. And I say pretty much because sometimes CF is still really irksome and frightening. But here I am, 13 years post-lung transplant, and the gift of breathing allows me to bear witness. My friend, the CF activist extraordinaire, whom all of you know, and writer Isabel Stenzel Burns invited me to face my inner voice in one of her final creative writing workshops entitled Writing to Heal. Isa posed the question to our cohort, how do you honor and remember people you've lost? Certainly this brought into focus the heartbreak of those we have loved and lost to the disease, but the question also prompted me to ponder people with CF whom I will never know or who have not been remembered, who've been forgotten altogether. The heart of our community is found in memory and storytelling. We have no monuments to those that CF has felled. We have no sites of mourning. So I began to address Issa's question through the story of the life of my mother's sister. And if you'd allow me in the final few minutes that we've probably run over with here, I'd like to read you a brief excerpt from a memoir in progress entitled Pneuma, the Latin word for breath and soul. You will be the first to hear this, and I'd be greatly honored to present this short bit to you. With that, we will start with part 2. Reclaiming a CF girl. I'm alone in my sorrow about Catherine. She was my mother's only sister. I never called her aunt because she wasn't one to me. I didn't even know her. Born Catherine Louise Badgley, August 5th, 1915. She died on her 20th birthday in 1935. I was 14 when I first learned about Catherine's illness, then death, and I now feel that my mother's decision, call it a compulsion, to talk about it simply had to be. Her faltering retelling of the tragedy was spoken in a tone of disbelief, as if she was still pretending it had never happened. I now think that Mom needed to mitigate the fear that she had about my diagnosis, strangely though, by talking to me. I think she felt, what would happen if she lost her daughter like she had lost her sister, and this plagued her? But there was not a diagnosis for Catherine. There could not be at the time in medical history. It was 3 years before Dr. Anderson had claimed CF as a rare disease. Nevertheless, I believe that Catherine died of cystic fibrosis. By late July of 1935, it was clear there'd be no birthday party. Catherine was far too sick, coughing and suffering with swollen belly and gastro problems. In a little note to her Aunt Anne, which I found a couple of years ago, Catherine wrote, "Auntie, don't know if you can read this. I'm lying in bed. I'm better. I'm drinking goat milk. It was so I could go in the car, but I ate the wrong food and got really, really worse." Despite the fact of not having a party, Catherine did have one idea for her birthday. It was a fine one, I thought. It was as if she was 7 or 8 years old. She'd set her mind on a new bicycle. She probably saw herself. She imagined herself riding down the driveway onto their old 2-lane blacktop, free at last. Never mind those sorry lungs. She would turn them pink and full of fresh air and find strength through willpower. And I imagine that in the perfect realm of her desire to be well and to be whole, she pedaled harder and harder until home disappeared into a band of haze that summer day. Splurging, truly splurging, with the desperate hope to brighten her birthday, my forlorn grandparents bought a top-of-the-line Schwinn Aero cycle. Pappy, as we called my granddad, brought it home in the back of the truck. It must have been there before August 5th, since Catherine wrote to her auntie again. "Dear auntie, I have already gotten as nice a present anybody could get. A new bicycle. It's red, white, and silver. I can see it standing there on the grass near the farmhouse." She also said to make my birthday present perfect, I would like to have a little tool case, a basket, and probably a little horn. That would make it just perfect. Your loving niece, Catherine. The anticipation of Catherine riding the bike somehow however impossible that was, must have aroused a quiver in the hearts of my grandparents and their younger daughter, my 12-year-old mom. They imagined Catherine would wheel off and, looking over her shoulder, raise an arm at them, ring the little bell, and give a happy wave at the three of them standing in the driveway, holding one another. I don't know what happened in the gulch of time between getting the bike home and Catherine's death. I think that her desire, excuse me, my grandparents' desire, all of it, these were acts of desperation, and why not? We must always dream. We must always make plans for the future, but that day she lay still. Family began to gather at the house, in the kitchen. The doctor arrived. The doors were closed. Then Pappy told Catherine's boyfriend, who'd come by every day since she was bedridden, and that day with a present, "Son, I'm sorry, but just go on home." Not much else was said, probably, I don't know. But for my sweet mother, still a child, the fact that she had forgotten what happened to the new red Schwinn and all other details must have been like losing a favorite doll during a tornado. The gigantic twister was just too smothering, too deafening, too black. Everything was swallowed up by it that day. Everything was lost. Decades later, I learned that Mom and my grandparents went to Catherine's grave every Sunday after church. They would lay out a picnic under the oak tree near her gravestone. And commune together as a family, as it were. Daniel and I found that old tree in 2022 when we went to the Ozarks of my ancestry. There, as Mom had described it, Catherine's grave lay alongside other kin of mine in the shadow of the big oak. The visit there was a healing for me because I felt the timeless presence of those people, and especially of Catherine that October afternoon. Yet a decade before we made the trip to Missouri, I had begun to see a murky reflection of Catherine and me. In a downward slide toward end-stage lung disease in 2010, something about her leaving no trace except a headstone at the cemetery deeply bothered me. I decided to retrieve her from obscurity, and I began to reconstruct her story, call it an intervention against loss. I inserted myself into Catherine's brief life as a way to reckon with her death somehow. In my imagination, I mean to calm an unspeakable fear and to assure her that she would not be forgotten. I mean to write her back into existence, to bring her forward in the light, to clarify her eyes and smile, to hear her. This force to restore Catherine from absence is an attempt to reclaim her life in connection with mine. In my latent coming compassion for her, I mourned her, but privately. I felt that she had suffered far more than I was experiencing during the wait for new lungs. But I never spoke about this, not even to Daniel. Yet a small voice said to me over and over, "Find me, find me." And I began to conjure Catherine in a series of visions. In one of the first, I am with my young mom, my grandparents, and Catherine in Nichols Junction, their home. The house smells of bacon and biscuits, talcum powder, and pasture from the dairy cows outside the house. I'm there from the future. I'm an angel, maybe an interloper. I want to bring them solace and reassure them about what life with CF has taught me, of how, even without medicine, I could help. I could help Catherine, but I realize that I need help too. In this imaginary stage, I am standing in Pappy's cornfield. I'm shorter than the tasseled crops, and I run through them, looking up for a clearance to the sky. I must have a sign. I must have a promise, I think. God is my partner to help. Where are the birds flying in patterns? Well, this alone would give me some sense about the order of things. A few or a flock would give me hope that a natural pattern to life will return, that Catherine will survive. But the birds do not fly over, and I return to the house heartbroken. There is no telling when the visions would appear. They were ad hoc and unrelated. I'm being shown 2 x-rays, one of me and one of Catherine. Our 2 sets of lungs are weirdly elegant, and their bluish tint reminds me of 19th century cyanotypes of flattened out English ferns. We're a near match, as the technician points out. Our frames and the width of our small rib cages are like those of twins. Our sternums are the most stunning things. Those identical breastbones protecting our hearts have the shape of Paleolithic tools. We're ancient. Our antiquity is precious and odd. We are nothing more than infrathin strata, a kind of evidence. But who are we really? In my favorite daydream, I'm an artist. I created a retablo, a devotional painting about the size of a piece of paper. In the upper left, Catherine is very small and lies on a little bed. My family, who were good Methodists, are devout Catholics in the picture, and they sit around the bed holding rosaries in prayer. In an oval vignette at the center of the picture, the Virgin of Guadalupe appears before them. They turn toward her slowly and begin to absorb the radiant sacred aura of the figure. In the next little section, the sick girl rises from the bed. She stands, she turns, and then my family sits all together for a meal, celebrating Catherine's cure, because purely true, a miracle has occurred. A pure miracle has occurred. A window is open behind the kitchen table. I painted the sky a pure turquoise. Happy as they are, filled with joy and complete relief, they do not notice, but a white dove has soared into the pure and infinite blue beyond them. Catherine will survive. In closing, one day the cure for cystic fibrosis will not be a dream. And despite what those of us with CF continue to endure, I believe that our challenges can open the heart for deep gratitude for what it is to be here now. I believe that our experiences should inspire us to be ambassadors that stand up for a more compassionate world. Who better than us? Who better than us to express this, since we have received a multitude of CF science's brilliant solutions and CF medicine's best practices and devoted attention. Our voices are critical. Our voices are critical because we, after all, are the living proof. Thank you so much.